All right, so we are going to the Native Americans, the first assignment on Native Americans. And to do that, I need to open this up and share. Okay. So hopefully you went over the sample and hopefully my reply, my written response to the sample gives you a good idea of what I'm generally anticipating from you. I'm easy on the first couple grades anyway, as you're trying to find your way regarding my subjective take on teaching and how to and how I'm going to grade them. So at any rate, with number one, right, it's a pretty upfront thesis. Is what you're looking for is that the um, the Euro-Americans who colonized the Americas, right? They had jurists. They had like these attorneys who were interpreters of the law, and they helped contribute to a written legal rationale for dispossessing the Native Americans, right, for taking their lands. And so they used terms that were quite condescending to the Native Americans. They used the legal term res nullius, and that refers to the humanities um, accessibility to uninhabited land. So, of course, right, there were uninhabited islands in the Caribbean when Columbus first hit the Caribbean in the 1490s. There were lands in South America. There were lands in North America, whereby at the time of the intrusion, there was no one inhabiting that neck of the woods. And so they used that term, right, and said, well, if whatever is uninhabited is open to humanity, and therefore we have the legal right to it. And then it got more complicated when it came to lands that were actually inhabited by Native Americans, and they could not get around that, right? And so there was a guy named Sepulveda in Spain who argued before the crown that the Catholic Church's notion of just war doctrine. I don't have time to get into that, but the reasons for which you fight and the manner by which you fight are to be upheld by certain standards. And then you could excuse yourself fighting as a good Catholic and not be held responsible for any deaths that might be incurred during battle. And so he contended that some of the tribes, like the Aztec and others, were following the devil, were not open to the gospel, and therefore were worthy of being foes in a just and holy war. And then in the case of just war, you are allowed to enslave prisoners of war. Okay. And then also if they're guilty of a crime, and the Spanish got around that one as well, with these, you know, quick ordinances that the natives supposedly transgressed, and then said that they had a right, therefore, to enslave them, and as well as take their land. So at any rate, when you it all goes back to the like the letters that Columbus had written to King Ferdinand of Aragon, Spain. With those letters, he was very condescending toward the Native Americans. He met the Arawak tribe. They swam out to him and they cut their hands out of ignorance of metallurgy and swords. They traded gold as if it were nothing. They were wearing it as nose rings and earrings, etc., accessories, and they didn't have a monetary value to it, as the Europeans obviously did. Um, and so, for those reasons, and also they were scarcely clad, and so that likened them to Adam and Eve before they had eaten the forbidden fruit, when they were innocent of sin and knew not that they were naked. And so he, a guy named Bartolome de las Casas, he really perpetuated and spread that image of Native Americans as being meek sheep, ovejas mansas. Um, and so they took that condescending stance toward them and said, well, you know what? They need to be civilized. We'll uplift them, we'll civilize them, we'll teach them the ways of Europe and of the world. And that was part of their legal rationale and their cultural rationale for dispossessing the Native Americans. Now, I say now, as convenient as that was to depict them as such, it was not historically accurate. And that's my simple thesis on number one. All right. Uh, you have you have a kind of narrative about cultural evolution that has been perpetuated by anthropology to this day, and it kind of has stuck. And that is that mankind were he hunted in small bands and was a hunter-gatherer. And then eventually he learned how to cultivate crops. And then in cultivating the crops, he could sustain a larger population sedentary wise at one spot, right? And then the necessity of growing and cultivating crops for a large number of people supposedly helped bring about a domino effect uh, towards civilization that tends to happen, according to anthropologists, virtually everywhere on the globe. All right, and so in order to command labor in large numbers, at least, the idea was is you need an autocrat, you need one person leader, and you need a like a police and military force to enforce it, right? Not to mention when it's harvest time and someone wants to come and steal your harvest, you have to be able to protect it as well. Then you have all the vagaries of weather and soil that you have to contend with, and you can't really always account for in cultivating your crops. And so thus ensued the development of a sacerdotal class, like the word sacerdote, priest in Spanish, a religious caste, okay, of leaders. And that often included some form of shamanism. And with shamanism, right, you have these people who are intermediaries between the physical world and the metaphysical world. And they usually have very similar types of methods that they utilize to try to become the middlemen in effecting or bringing about um, favorable conditions for farming. And so there's oftentimes some type of purification, some type of sacrifice, sometimes getting into an altered state by taking some type of hallucinogen, etc. Those are all parts of shamanism. And so you develop a religious class as well. And then the notion is as you become more comfortable, kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you're no longer worried about your immediate concern with safety, with wild animals or someone else attacking you. You're no longer worried about where your next meal is going to come from as you're storing extra food. And so then your mind and your preoccupations and your behavior, etc., can go on to higher level issues, right? And so one thing that you supposedly develop or is a penchant for aesthetics. Aesthetics is like man's subjective pursuit of beauty. So you have the development of music, of a written language, in literature, poetry, the arts and sciences, going after truth, etc. Ontology, the study of existence. Why are we here? So philosophy, religion, all that is supposed to develop as well. And then with that, right, people are looking for finer things of life by now in this comfortable state. And so you develop an artisan class of skilled workers who create everything from, furniture and nice clothing and jewelry uh, uh, to more just utilitarian things like tools and extra weapons, etc. And then oftentimes, you become open to what other regions, other tribes, other confederations have, and so you develop a merchant class to trade back and forth. So before you know it, you have a so-called complex society of multiple classes. All right, and so at any rate, that's what the Europeans were looking for. All right. They wanted to see that you could manipulate the environment and farm, engage in some type of impressive architectural feats, that you could sustain a large population that is complex in nature and has a myriad of classes. They were looking to see if you were delving into the arts and sciences, if you had technological breakthroughs. Um, and then, of course, they were looking at your religion, which Native Americans could not win, right? Because they had never heard of Christ and hence could not be Christian if they've never even heard um, of the Bible, etc. So at any rate, what we say here is we play the game. We say, okay, Europeans, this is your criteria for civilized status, not the natives. However unfair that is, you won, and so the winners get to impose their culture, their norms, their values onto others. So we use your European measuring stick, but even using your measuring stick, your barometer, Native Americans fared pretty darn well. All right. So I give evidence of the farming revolution being not that far behind in Mesoamerica than it was back in the old world, back in China and Egypt and Mesopotamia. I give evidence of some uh, impressive cities that existed before Christ, quite a long time ago. They're still looking into a place called Tiwanaku in South America. That place had running water. It had limestone painted pyramids and buildings, and it hosted a pretty large population, it seems. And that was before Christ, Tiwanaku. And then you also had the uh, the Olmec, right? And they're known as the mother culture. They're the ones with the big stone head places at San Lorenzo and La Venta. And so you have the Olmec, and that was as early as 1800 BC. And they started a hieroglyphic writing system, mathematics with the concept of zero, astronomical expertise, um, uh, historical and other dictation and writing and records on their stelae, on their stones that had hieroglyphic writings on them. And so, at any rate, some people start with the Olmec at 1800 BC. And then you also had Teotihuacan. And Teotihuacan was so impressive astronomically in its placement with the stars, and its placement with the planet Venus, and its placement with the sun and the moon um, at solstice, that people called it the city of the gods. In their pantheon and their mythology, they contended that the gods themselves came down to Teotihuacan and helped form that city. And in one of their creation myths, as you may know, they believed that they had created mankind four times before and destroyed their creation four times, so that we're literally living under the fifth creation, the fifth sun. So at any rate, then of course, in about 250 AD to about 900 AD, you had the heyday of the Maya. And the Maya, um, they added a syllabic nature to their language, their written language. So it was not just pictographic, but it was also syllabic, which made it much more versatile. Um, they took the beginnings of the calendar and turned it into the 365-day long count calendar uh, um, of 20 months of 18 days and 5 days of ill omen and or 18 months of 20 days, I'm sorry, and 5 days of ill omen. And they were aware that they're about a quarter of a day short, or as we are with leap year. And so it was pretty impressive what they put together. Oftentimes, for a long time, they were known as the Greeks of the old world. They put together Chalam Balam. They put together what was the other one? Oh, it's eluding me right now. But it's a story of the creations, the four different creations and with the gods and so forth. I had to read it as a student. Um, but at any rate, they put together a complex pantheon of gods and myths surrounding those gods and creation of man, etc. So they had quite a literary record with them. The limestone, polychrome, corbelled architecture, just very, very impressive architecture. Their pyramids are just something else in the Yucatan today. So they had the Petén Peninsula, Palenque, Tikal, and these other just very, very impressive sights to see to this very day. And it really bothers me that I have not had the chance to see any of them yet. But at any rate, so you have the Maya. And by the way, they found that the Maya were a lot more militarily oriented than previously thought. Um, you have, for instance, their writing system, right? They'll have a line that means 5 years, and dots above it are 1 year each. So you have something, and then from the previous dictation, and then you'll have a line and three dots. So they're saying 8 years later. Um, then they'll have a picture of a gentleman with the Tlaloc, the rain and thunder god, who was a war god, glasses, goggles, like as they wore in Teotihuacan when they wore to battle, these war goggles, and a an anthropomorphic hand, an animal's hand. It's a jaguar's paw attached to his body, and he is subjugating, has his knees down on the head of someone who is wearing a feathered headdress. And the feathered headdress almost always pertain to central Mexico, the leaders, the Toltec, and other leaders in central Mexico. So they would be saying, right, that 8 years later, the Maya, who are perceived through the jaguar paw and the war goggles, conquered the central Mexican Toltec. And so, at any rate, it's very interesting stuff what they have available. But like I said, their knowledge of the solstice and the equinox were just right on target. All right, and a lot of them because they believed that Quetzalcoatl, there was a good and an evil twin, and Quetzalcoatl was the good twin, or tied to him, and that he had been killed in Xibalba down in the underworld. He had sacrificed himself, but he rose up resurrection style into the planet Venus. And so they were really big on the planet Venus. So then you fast forward to the U.S. territory. And for the longest time, what is held at the helm of it all, uh, chronologic, chronologically speaking, has been ironically the dry, arid Southwest of New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah, the famous Four Corners. If you look up Chaco Canyon, Pueblo Bonito, Snake Town, you have some very impressive cities that were established in this dry, arid area. And yes, with weather and with topography, things have changed throughout the millennia. And supposedly it was not as arid as it is now. Nevertheless, it still was not that, verdant and luxuriant ever that they know of. And that they used a complicated irrigation system and farming was quite impressive so early. So you're talking about the time of Christ with the Anasazi, and then after the Anasazi you have the Hohokam, and there was one other group as well. They're collectively known as the Pueblo because they put together pueblos, cities. All right. But what may overtake them, and we don't know yet, is found in the next one, and that is the Mississippi River mound cultures, right? Found with these huge mounds, with their chiefs, with all this jewelry and fine paraphernalia. that they're buried with, as well as the servants that had to be killed with them to serve them in the next life, and also large snake. Um, uh, I hate to say decorations, but symbolism. And so you have evidence of large populations, complex society, mass cultivation of crops, and trade from far away, etc. So, for instance, right, and this is the same thing with a Pueblo, is you had copper found from Lake Manitoba, Canada, in some of their burial sites. You had mother of pearl found from the Gulf of Mexico. You had other things that were found on the East Coast, the Atlantic coast of what is now the United States. So they engaged in widespread trade. And but what's interesting, right, is they have found certain burials that stand out by the decoration and by the height of the leader that was buried. I kid you not, the height of their leaders oftentimes were anywhere from 6.5 to 7 feet tall. And they received the name Adena as if perhaps a distinctive people amongst the mound builders. And what they also found that was interesting were kilns. Kilns were evidence of metallurgical undertakings, so perhaps making something like bronze or iron or copper. And that was not known for the Native Americans to mine metallurgical things until now. And so the Adena, very interesting. They're still finding stuff out, and they keep pushing the Adena further and further chronologically back before Christ. And so before you know it, when all is said and done, the Adena may take the place of the chronologically first native evidence of reaching, quote, the Europeans' notion of civilized status. All right, so I'm just saying that that simply is not true, that they fared pretty darn well. All right. Then this one is pretty simple, it's pretty straightforward. Is Native Americans, by way of their religious differences, by way of the fact that they had a usufruct notion of property. That is, they had private property. They allotted property to chiefs, and chiefs allotted it to some of their people in their tribes and confederations. But it was always for use, right? Usufruct. As long as you needed it and your family used it, it was yours. But then when that ceased to be, it was handed on to somebody else. And so with Europeans, right, their notion is proprietorship. And with proprietorship is no, I own this. I don't care if I cultivate it or not. I don't care if I need the land or not. It's mine. My kids and their kids and their kids are all going to inherit it, and it belongs to us. So, you don't find that really notion. I think to a lot of Native American tribes, that notion of property ownership was seen as arrogant. Okay. And so, because of religious differences, because of differences on property ownership, and because the Native Americans tended to allow the Euro Americans and Europeans that came to take advantage of them and trade, um, that the Euro Americans began to look down upon the Native Americans as if they were better and they could take advantage of them at will, etc. And it's sad, it's unfair, but it is what it is. That's what I'm contending on number two. All right. And so I get into some specifics like pantheism. Everything is interconnected, and including God or whatever your notion of God or the creator is. And it's connected to all animals, trees, inanimate objects, people, etc. That didn't float with the Christians. Shamanism and the use of hallucinogenic drugs and so forth to try to delve into the spiritual realm. That did not work with the Europeans. Polytheism, believing in multiple gods, did not work. They couldn't win with religion. They just simply couldn't. Um, they were judged rather harshly. And yeah, so that's that with number two. It's pretty upfront thesis. Let's see here. And then lastly, the Iroquois. All right. So with the Iroquois, what I say is the Europeans wanted, they had a taste for the exotic in the early middle and the early modern era. We're talking like 15, 1600s. Okay. Um, they wanted to hear crazy stories about these wild redskins, right? And so that's exactly what some of the Dutch chroniclers gave them. And the Iroquois gave them just that, with some of their rights, some of their manners by which they fought wars. It played right into the hands of of a credulous public that wanted to read just that. All right. So, like with the Iroquois, they'd fight, they'd take prisoners of war, and they would allow the elderly women to decide what to do with them. They could decide on the spot that they wanted to adopt them. They could decide on the spot that they wanted them sacrificed or killed. And they also decided if they wanted them to have to prove their worthiness as a warrior. And their warrior attributes had to be shown by running the gauntlet, where you'd have two rows of Iroquois warriors, and they'd have to run between these two rows with armed men attacking them. And you either survived or you didn't through the gauntlet. And then sometimes they would decide that you were such a great warrior that they wanted to consume you. And so then they would burn you tie you to a stake, burn and cook you and eat you ceremoniously. And of course, they were believing that they were imbibing your warrior spirit by eating your flesh. So this is exactly what Europe wanted to hear. They're like, wow, these exotic Iroquois, they're crazy. And then not to mention the Iroquois attacked the Huron, their ancient enemy, and other tribes. They took over the St. Lawrence River Valley, where they had a lot of beaver pelts, and they made sure that they themselves could provide the beaver pelts at the prices that they dictated to the Euro Americans. All right. So at any rate, with Iroquois, I say there's so much more to them than that. That yes, you could just pick and choose data and take it out of context and not understand why they're doing what they're doing, and and make these monsters out of them. But that's not fair. So at any rate, I go into how the Morning War, they were landlocked in present day New York, and surrounded by enemy tribes who had direct trading routes with the Europeans on the coast. And in that direct trade, they were receiving European guns, even though they were not supposed to. They were. So they received European guns and they had a huge leg up over the Iroquois, their enemy. And so the Iroquois saw the writing on the wall and said, something needs to be done or we're going to go extinct. But despite the fact that they did not have a direct trade route with the Europeans, to get guns, as their rival tribes did, they still received the blunt end of European pathogens that made their way slowly inland. And so many cases have been quoted whereby the Iroquois were decimated by disease, by European disease. So what they would do, right, is they'd declare a mourning war, like a state of emergency, and in mourning for those who had died, they said we need replacements or we're not going to survive as a tribe. And so that's why they would engage in these raids and these battles and these wars to try to get as many prisoners of war adopted and re-quickened as their old dead ones, as substitutes for them, as quickly as possible. That's why they broke through and took over the St. Lawrence Valley so that they could get guns from the Europeans in return for the pelts, and not allow their enemy tribes to have a monopoly on the European firearms. And then in addition to that, they had a great League of Peace. They had what I think this is arguable, but might be a better example of a federal republic than Rome was, and Rome is, as our example of having a federal republic for a government. They had some elected offices, some were given to the old, wise, and the elderly. Um, some were given to those who fought the best in war. They had checks and balances. They had limited autonomy within each tribe. Um, and then, of course, they would try to put what the Germans used to call a Wehrgild, um, um, the value of each human being. It would have to be paid if someone were murdered, especially from one tribe to another. They would have to pay for it in wampum and in goods, to try to keep blood feuds down, so that there wouldn't just be this indiscriminate killing going on and on, in a state of vendetta against one family or tribe against another, right? It was a way of keeping the peace, is having to pay these Wehrgilds for the death of somebody. And so they had an exact protocol that was followed with their diplomacy, and it was quite impressive. Benjamin Franklin spoke much of the Iroquois evidently at the Constitutional Convention, and said there was much to emulate with our own government. So at any rate, I say there's a lot more to the Iroquois than them, running the gauntlet and eating a prisoner of war. That's not fair to just stop there in your narrative of the Iroquois. And I say that is emblematic of all the tribes, that you can't just do a caricature of taking this or that out of context just because the reading public wants to see, these fierce animal-like natives in their books. All right. So if I may ask, is there anyone connected with me today, right now? All right. Because I wanted to be sure that you got extra credit. All right. Well, I hope this helps. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and say goodbye, but I hope this helped, and good luck on your first assignment. Okay. All right. Bye.